Hello and welcome to Talks of Google. My name is Robert Worthy and I'm delighted you could join us either today or live on the YouTube catch-up. We are joined today by Oliver Burkeman, author of 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It. Oliver is the author of The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and for many years wrote a popular weekly column on psychology for The Guardian, This Column Will Change Your Life. He has a devoted following for his writing on productivity, mortality, the power of limits, and building a meaningful life in an age of bewilderment. Please join me in thanking Oliver for joining us today. Oliver.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. This is great.
Thank you so much for coming. Well, look, I am genuinely excited about talking to you through 4,000 Weeks. I have so many questions, so many thoughts about it. Perhaps you could start by telling us, what does 4,000 Weeks represent? Why the title of the book?
So 4,000 Weeks is extremely approximately the average human lifespan in the West expressed in terms of weeks. If you live to be 80, you'll have had a few more than that, as I'm sure people can figure out. It's pretty straightforward mental arithmetic, but it's I completely rounded it to a sort of punchy round number. It's basically how much we can reasonably expect to get to play with in terms of
and it feels like a very small number when represented in weeks, and indeed even those who live to be 100, it's the order of 6,000 weeks. It's not a lot.
Right. No, there's something very interesting about weeks, because if you express it in days, well, it's a very large number. If you express it in years, it's very small, but we have the feeling that a year goes on forever, so it doesn't really matter. It's that middle zone where you're expressing it in a relatively small number of a quantity that nonetheless we feel is very brief and irrelevant in the course of our lives. It doesn't seem like if you waste a week of your life, it ought to matter. Yeah,
that's very cool. So the book broadly speaks about how do we choose what we choose? So perhaps we could kind of touch upon some of those subjects. You open by talking about acknowledging and embracing the limit embracing life, and how time has perhaps had a different meaning to people over the ages. Perhaps you could talk about that and how we think about time now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think part of what I find myself doing in talking about this book is sort of deflecting a potential interpretation of that title. I mean, I'm glad we gave this book an attention-grabbing title, but there's a misinterpretation, I think, which would be like, okay, time is incredibly short, therefore the only way to make the most use of it is to live in a kind of white knuckle, very self-conscious and strenuous attempt to sort of eke the most out of every day, and do extreme sports every weekend, and never lose a second. And I think that actually what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a huge amount of relief as well as energy and motivation and focus that comes from acknowledging how limited we are with respect to time, and thus seeing all the different ways in which, and we can talk about this, I'm sure, especially in kind of productivity culture and time management, but not only, all the ways in which we proceed as if we might find a way to fit everything in. We might find a way to become so efficient as to not have to encounter the ramifications of being finite. So it's really about a sort of dropping back down to the ground and making time for a handful of things that really matter, and giving up this impossible struggle to sort of be infinite with respect to time, as opposed to this kind of very exhausting and rather stressful kind of carpe diem approach, which you do see in popular culture, and which I think ultimately is actually just another form of the attitude that I'm criticizing in the book. To go even further into sort of unseating our conventional views of time, yes, you're right. I think there's lots of good evidence that the example I give in the book is English medieval peasants, although I think it would also apply to many different cultures at different times in history, perhaps also to some indigenous cultures today, that this whole notion of time as something separate from you, time is as a resource that you have to use well, or that you could be guilty of wasting, or that you need to sort of save through efficiency techniques. The whole conceptual basis of that distinction, I think we can confidently say, just wouldn't have occurred to a kind of working class laborer in early medieval England, right? Time for them and for many other people, it would have followed the patterns that anthropologists call task orientation, right? So instead of thinking about your activities as lined up against a schedule or a timeline or a calendar or something, it's the tasks themselves that would have given the rhythm to the day. Time would have just been the medium in which your life unfolded, rather than something that you could sort of psychologically objectify and then be tormented by or try to dominate or feel hounded by. And, the productivity guru who had gone up to a medieval farmer and said, like, why don't you do all the milking for the month all on one day to get it out of the way, because batching your tasks is a really great way to get more things done. I mean, obviously that would have been lunacy, and still today it's essentially lunacy as an approach to milking cows, because those things just need doing when they need doing, and crops need harvesting when they need harvesting. And I think we all, or many of us, have some experience of this kind of time. I think that one very obvious example is in the first few months with a newborn baby, but I think that you don't have to be a parent to have been in places where that kind of sense of the schedule, the sense of the timetable falls away, and you're just sort of in time. It has its disadvantages, because you can't build a sort of industrial, technologically advanced society without that objectified idea of time. But it has some big advantages as well, which are a kind of peace of mind that I think is a lot harder for us to access today.
It was you spoke about when you time used to be measured in how long it takes to do a task. So how long it's taking. So you say a minute or an hour, you'd say, the time it takes to bring in the hay or milk the cow, milk the cow. It actually made me think of, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we measure time in the length of her favorite TV shows. Like, how long will it take to get to this bus stop? Well, at the time it takes to watch 2 of these shows. So actually, for children who don't understand minutes and hours, we still use task-based times. I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And even that kind of comparison, like, I don't think that would have been the normal way of talking. My understanding of the literature is it wouldn't have been a normal way of talking about time. It's just that when you had to do some comparing, like, there wasn't the widespread notion, there wasn't a sort of widespread adoption of clocks or of time measuring devices among ordinary people. So yeah, you just have to grasp for some other task as a comparator. And people tend to think that life moved more slowly back then as another example of this, but I think that probably that concept of life moving slowly would have been the thing that didn't make sense if you sort of time travel back to medieval England. It's not that life moved more slowly, but just like, what slowly as compared to what? I mean, it's just life. It's just unfolding. It's only sort of post-industrialization that it is ubiquitous to think about life unfolding according to something that isn't life, a timeline or a yardstick. You get it in ancient Greece and Rome, like, you get all sorts of things, but that's a new thing for almost everybody in the world to be thinking as a way of governing their lives.
And perhaps post-internet, we not only compare ourselves to how much we can cram into a day, but how much others are able or seem to be able to cram into a day. And so the question of, how do I do all of the things? It's not just all of those big rocks that I want to accomplish, but that others seem to be doing. Which I think perhaps you could talk about your dislike of the big rocks parable, which for those, I imagine many of those do know, but for those who don't know, it's how do you fit the big rocks, the small rocks, and the sand into a jar? The idea being you have to put the big rocks in first, and then the smaller things can fit around those. But right. You dislike that for a very good reason.
Well, this is a metaphor for prioritization, and it says, if you want to have time to do everything that counts, just make sure you make time first for the things that really matter. Yeah, I mean, I think there is some wisdom in here, but my basic objection is that this is a rigged experiment. The person in the parable who is bringing these rocks and pebbles and sand into the classroom or seminar room or wherever it's supposed to happen has only brought enough rocks that he knows in advance will fit into the jar. And I don't think that our primary problem on the level of individual time management today is that we prioritize things badly, although we do. I think it is that there are too many big rocks. There are too many things that genuinely matter. And, you know, if we had 40 hours in a day, we could still fill that time with things that genuinely mattered. It isn't that if you find the right tricks and techniques, you'll be able to get rid of only all the unimportant, tedious stuff and then spend your life in this kind of unfolding of just pure meaningfulness and feel like you're doing everything. It's like, no, you're going to have to not do lots of things that do matter in order to make time for the things that you care about the most out of those things.
Let's talk about the efficiency trap. So you talk about the curse, perhaps, of clearing the decks. We all come in, and I've seen people block out the first hour of their calendars to clear emails. You talk about how that actually creates more work.
Right. I mean, this is something that I'm sure a number of people watching will be familiar with in other contexts, right? This general idea, which crops up as all sorts of other paradoxes, the Jevons paradox in energy efficiency and a bunch of others, that if you make a system more efficient without regard to any other governing value, you just pursue greater efficiency in processing things through the system, then all else being equal, the system will fill with more and more stuff rather than bringing peace of mind, and will or like empty time or capacity, and it will fill with more and more junk rather than good stuff. So applied to time management, the idea here is, you know, if you get incredibly good at processing your email, all else being equal, what will happen is you'll just get more email because you'll reply to people and they'll reply to you, and those replies will generate replies and they'll go on forever. You get a reputation for being responsive to email, so more people will reach out to email you. And just in general, email, unless it's stopped by some other act on your part, email will just come to dominate your life more and more, in direct contradiction to your initial motivation to sort of bring email under control. This is Parkinson's law. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. It's that thing where they widen motorways to relieve traffic congestion, and it makes it provides an added incentive for more drivers to use that route, and so the congestion sort of tends gradually back towards where it originally was. So when I'm talking about the efficiency trap, I'm talking about a thing which I think is encouraged by a lot of sort of less good productivity advice and productivity culture, which is this idea that there is some inherent benefit in just getting more efficient at doing more things in a smaller amount of time. Firstly, there's no benefit in doing things per se, unless they're the right things to do. And then secondly, you get into this problem where the more stuff that comes across your radar, the more likely you are to accept additional things to do that actually aren't worth your time, because none of these incoming things will have to meet this filter, or sort of get over this hurdle of, is this worth sacrificing something else for? Because you've convinced yourself that you're going to have time for everything. When I was working as a journalist on a sort of day-to-day as a feature writer at The Guardian, the better I got at doing stuff, the more efficient I got at doing stuff, the more I began to realize that what I was really good at was doing stuff that didn't matter, and that the things that I really cared about would just get endlessly postponed while I told myself, I was clearing the decks, which was your original question, and we could talk more about that. But anyway, I'll stop there for now.
No, that's really cool. And I certainly know when I clear the decks, I actually get a little like a endorphin rush for sort of having done something, and like that, the element of completeness. But and I don't want to perhaps address the more difficult task. But let's talk about you talk about finitude, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I've sort of summarized as acknowledging our mortality, which sounds a bit bleak, but actually when you accept that and think about it, it can be liberating. Perhaps you could talk about that concept you've coined.
I mean, I didn't invent the word finitude. People do wonder about how to pronounce it. All I can say is, in the audiobook for this, I say finitude a lot. So I really hope that's the right pronunciation. I just mean, yes, this is a consequence of the fact that we die, but I don't think that this book is really about, it's not really about death and dying and mortality and that kind of very melodramatic kind of and very difficult aspect of human existence. It's not about suggesting that anyone can sort of completely confront their mortality. I certainly don't think I have. But rather, the fact that our time is limited and that we are sort of material creatures in limited time with limited energy and limited attentional bandwidth and all the rest of it, the consequence of this, I'm sort of wrapping up in this word finitude, to refer to the state of being limited and therefore having to make, by definition, trade-offs, and to exist in a world of opportunity costs and having to make tough decisions, not being able to do all the things that we are, psychologically able to think about and imagine, not being able to meet all the demands that society might throw at us. There's just no reason to assume that if we can think of something or somebody can ask something of us, that there's capacity for it in a human life. Beyond a certain point, there won't be, and these kind of sacrifices will just be built into the situation. So I think what I'm saying for a big chunk of the book is that, like, this is such an uncomfortable feeling that we pursue all sorts of ultimately counterproductive activities to sort of engage in emotional avoidance, to feel like we're limitless when we're not. I think that a lot of distraction is based on, is rooted in that. We could talk about that if you like. And I think a lot of time management stuff, and certainly the years I spent as a sort of weirdo productivity geek, still am a little bit, but recovering maybe, it was about trying to achieve a kind of control over my time and my projects and my work and my life that would, that subliminally would enable you not to have to confront this finite situation.
Yeah, you define distraction is motivated by the desire to try to flee something painful about our experience of the present, which I quite liked. And we think about, well, perhaps we could talk about the attention economy and how that feeds kind of our desire to be distracted and sort of feel like we're achieving something, whereas actually we're not achieving anything.
Sure. I mean, I don't know the individual details of people watching this, but I don't feel that any of you are likely to need a sort of basic introduction to the idea of the attention economy. What I'm trying to explore in the book is, well, 2 points really. Firstly, how that attention is so fundamental to the experience of life that calling it a resource, like a limited resource, people talk about it, is almost a misnomer. There's a sense in which attention just is life, and what you pay attention to over the course of your life will sum up to what your life will have been. So it's an incredibly serious thing to be involved with, either as a user of technology or as someone working in digital technology. But also, secondly, this thing that I don't think gets enough attention, which is, I have many criticisms of social media platforms and algorithmically driven, attention mining, effectively. But we talk a lot as if this is a sort of force that we. I mean, if you read a lot of stuff or you watch, the Social Dilemma, etc., you might be left with the impression that the typical moment of digital distraction is one in which, I'm sort of working away on a piece of writing and I'm feeling thrilled by it and it's so wonderful and I'm really enjoying myself. And then like somehow the evil tendrils of Silicon Valley come and sort of grab me unwillingly away from my work. And I do think that some of the tendrils of Silicon Valley are evil and that we should talk critically about them. But that's not what happens. What happens is I'm finding the work unpleasant or intimidating or boring or difficult, and I am thrilled by the opportunity to go and scroll down my phone for a bit instead and do something, to leave aside something that I thought was what really mattered to me and go and do something that, by definition, if it's distraction, like, doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking in the book at the idea that basically what's going on here is that it's not a coincidence that things that matter to us induce discomfort. They bring us up against the limits of our capacities and our ability to control how time unfolds. You're writing a chapter of your novel, you don't know that it's going to go well. You don't know you've got what it takes. You don't know that people will receive it well. It might be forgotten or ignored or mocked. You want to have an important, difficult conversation with your spouse. You don't know how it's going to unfold. It might leave you feeling emotionally vulnerable. It might lead to an angry exchange. You don't have that control. It's precisely because these things matter that they evoke these uncomfortable feelings. And then I think it feels absolutely wonderful to do something less important instead, and to sort of zone out. And I think the phenomenology of the internet is a super interesting part of this, because actually these days, we've always been distractible for these reasons, but these days, not only, Samuel Johnson wrote about it, but not only do we have reason to flee the stuff we care about because of discomfort, but we have a place to go when we're fleeing it that, phenomenologically speaking, does feel kind of limitless. It does feel like a realm where limits don't apply, where you can portray yourself how you like, find out about things that are happening thousands and thousands of miles away in virtually no time at all. It's very seductive as a way not to confront the sort of limitations of being a human creature in time. But I do think that ultimately it's only by confronting some of those limitations that we make progress on the things that we care about. So it's finding some way to tolerate or accommodate or get friendly with that discomfort, I think, is pretty much a superpower when it comes to thriving in the modern world.
Yeah, no, and I certainly struggle that. I know every time I delete my on purpose forget my password for social media, I get distracted by the news or putting on the radio or something else. Well, look, the second half of your book really speaks about the concept of time and how we define it and how we think about it. I thought I might just read a small section which really spoke to me at the beginning of chapter 8.
Sure.
There's another sense in which treating time as something that we own and get to control seems to make life worse. Inevitably, we become obsessed with using it well, whereupon we discover an unfortunate truth. The more you focus on using time well, the more each day begins to feel like something you have to get through en route to some calmer, better, more fulfilling point in the future, which never actually arrives. This future chasing, or I think you call it like the when I finally view of ourselves. I mean, is that just part of the human condition? Is that something we can acknowledge? I know I'm always sort of doing something to get to the next stage. How have you thought about that, and how we can, for want of a better phrase, live more in the moment?
Yeah, such an interesting
big question. I know.
Challenge. Yeah, no. Well, we can come to that, because I have thoughts about that. But yeah, I think that I think that an instrumental approach to experience, right, to doing things now for some future gain, is absolutely sort of, as old as humanity. Nothing would ever get done if people couldn't sort of persevere to do things, and building civilization would never have happened. I think then once we all enter into this very instrumentalized notion of time that we were talking about at the beginning, where we're all trying to use not only the resources around us, but we're thinking of time as a resource to use well, then again, it becomes something we have to do. I wouldn't have written this book if I wasn't willing to instrumentalize time in a certain sense, and nobody would ever get anything done in their professional lives if they didn't. So I'm really talking about a kind of over investment in that stance, a sense that I think is driven especially by the economic system that we live in and the stage that that's at now. Excuse me. Where it becomes the only form of value, it all too easily, that sort of instrumental mindset just sort of forces everything else out. So in other words, you come to think about every moment of time only, or pretty much only, in terms of its value for some future moment of time. And that, when it's taken to that absolute place, that clearly is self-defeating and an irrational and unfortunate way to be, because it's by definition you're placing the whole value of life constantly at some point that is not now, and it only ever is now. So you're never going to kind of cash out the value of life and find value in the moment. So I think it's about sort of having the ability to take both of those perspectives. It's certainly, I don't recommend, and I certainly have never attained myself, the ability to care only about this precise moment and not where it's leading. But I think that, overinvestment in that, we see the effects of that all around us in sort of sapping the meaning from people's lives. Like, what is this all for? Because they're aware on some level that what it's all for, that when they get to the time where it's supposedly all for, it'll all still be for something in the future from then as well, and so on.
I think for me, it felt like trying to find the fun in the moment, and perhaps you think about childhood, where nursery leads to reception leads to this year, and you're then working towards university, and university is for a job, and job is for retirement. And at what point are you sort of having fun in the moment?
Right.
Perhaps you could you talk about within our how we work with time and what we think about it, rediscovering rest and hobbies for the sake of it. And perhaps when we think about having more fun, do we do enough activities which we only do for their own sake? You've just moved to Yorkshire, where you probably have more opportunities to go for a walk in the countryside.
Yeah, I'm
having a walk.
I'm really putting my claims to the test here, because I've got no excuse left anymore not to spend a significant chunk of my time hiking on the North York Moors. So if I don't, then I really am condemned as a failure of embracing the moment. So we shall see. I've been here 2 weeks. I've been on a couple of hikes. I'll report back later. I think that this exclusive focus on the instrumental use of time is sort of at its most ironic in the context of leisure, because if you're even treating your leisure as a means to an end, solely as a means to an end, then what's left? Certainly the sort of ancient Greek, speaking broadly, conception of leisure was that it was the goal of everything else. So you maybe had to work, and you maybe had to do all sorts of things, but the reason you were doing them all was so that you could get the time, the leisure time that was sort of life in its highest expression, which admittedly for ancient philosophers tends to mean what you should do with that time is philosophy. So that's doesn't necessarily follow, but so I'm sort of making the case in the book for something that the contemporary philosopher Kiran Satia has described as atelic activities, things that you do not because of what they're leading up to or amounting to, that are not defined by some kind of end point. Hiking is a fun example, just because anyone who has any experience of enjoying a walk in the country knows you probably drive the car to a car park somewhere, and then you either go in a loop back to the car, or you walk a few miles to an extreme point and turn around and come back. If you wanted to do either of those things most efficiently, the simplest way would just be not to go on the hike in the first place. All you're doing is getting back to where you started. Now, there are instrumental benefits. It's good for your physical fitness. You might be recording your route on all these social apps for now that enable you to share your all the views that you're gazing out over. But basically, you hike to hike, and as Satia says, there's not going to you're not going to get to a point in your life where you think, okay, I've done all the hiking I'd aimed to do. That job is complete. You are going to stop, but you're not going to stop because you've reached the end of a project or exhausted an activity. You're just going to stop because eventually you will, or your interests might change, or you may be too old and frail to continue, or any number of things. And that kind of, I think that's what is crystallized in the idea of a hobby. And I think it's probably why the idea of a hobby feels a little bit cringe and embarrassing in the modern world, right? Unlike, as I say, unlike side hustles, which are hobbies that have a very clear instrumental value that you're going to make money out of them, and they are they are cool and hip, and it's good to have a side hustle. It's kind of embarrassing to have a hobby, and I think that is, at least in part, because they don't fit, and they are sort of culturally subversive in a way. They don't fit into this idea that everything has got to be for something else, and quite possibly that something else is financial profit, but not necessarily. It's all for something other than itself, and that's not true of of going on a hike. So yeah.
No, that's very cool. I've written on my notes here, painting staring, which I've not yet had the time to go and find 3 hours to do this. But perhaps you could talk about. I haven't got the name of the lady who suggests doing it, but perhaps you could talk about that and what you found in taking 3 hours out of a day to stare
at painting. Yeah, totally. I mean, this is the part of the book where I'm writing about patience and impatience, and I think that one way to understand the feeling of impatience that is as ubiquitous today as ever, it's another example of the way we rail against our limitation, right? And in that case, it's the limitation of how fast we can force the rest of the world to go, and this idea that certain activities just take the time they take and sort of dictate their own speed, and we just have to, if we want to get the benefit of them, we just have to fit around that instead of trying to constantly accelerate them up to the level where we would feel like we were the ones in control of them. There's an art historian at Harvard called Jennifer Roberts, who asks all her incoming students to do this exercise where they have to select a painting or a sculpture in the Cambridge, Boston area and go and look at it for 3 hours straight. I think they're allowed to take bathroom breaks, but that's it, right? It's just you sit there, stand there. I think folding chairs are useful here, and look at it for 3 hours. And the point is, she knows that's a crazily long amount of time. She knows that how people react to that. Her insight is that it's very easy to think that you've seen a painting just because you've looked at it for a couple of seconds. And that the tempo of life that her students are exposed to today through technology, through the hyper-competitive atmosphere at universities like Harvard, and all the rest of it, is such that she needs to play a role as a teacher in deliberately making the tempo be much, 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 much slower to sort of make them go through the discomfort of staying in that one place to the point where you can then see things. You really do see things in a painting if you look for that sort of absurdly long amount of time. And I went to do this. I went to meet her at Harvard, and I sat in the Harvard Art Museums and looked at a painting by Degas for 3 hours, taking notes. That's allowed. And I spent the first half hour thinking I'd totally chosen the wrong painting. I should have chosen something with more to look at, which was just a manifestation of the impatience, right? And you go through then another hour of sort of all kinds of fidgety, awful discomfort. But on the other side of that, I genuinely did literally see things in this painting that I hadn't seen until then. I'm not using see metaphorically to mean like I had thoughts about what it could mean. I literally saw shadows and facial expressions and lines that seemed to suggest areas of space that I hadn't previously seen. It's extraordinary, and it's just a sort of slightly extreme example of the benefit of letting something that you're engaged with take its time. I think a more day-to-day example, stop me if you want to move on to something else, but I think a more day-to-day example of this is just like reading, especially kind of reading fiction. People
this me particularly.
Right. People say these days that they can't find time to read. That's a very common complaint. And I think it's true to some extent, but mainly I don't think people mean that they don't have a half hour in a 24-hour period when they could read a book. Some people are that busy, but I think a lot of us are not. It's that when we find that half hour and sit down with, say, a novel, we're too sort of amped up and too running too fast to slow down to the speed that reading a novel or reading a lot of nonfiction books too requires. So you're sort of, the flywheel is turning so fast that it feels really unpleasant to slow it down. So naturally, people want to read summaries and synopses, or find techniques of speed reading to bring reading up to the speed of the rest of life. And I think those do have some benefits for just sort of sheer information absorption. But the real experience of reading a good book is just one that, like, there's a little amount of acceleration you can bring to it, but beyond that, it just takes the time it takes. It's given by the book, the speed, right? It's not given by you. You don't get to dictate how fast it goes. I guess just finally on this topic, I always think it's so fascinating how, as technology has caused it to take much less time to do things that previously took a long time, we actually get more and more impatient rather than less impatient.
Yeah.
Why is it so much more frustrating to wait 8 seconds for a really badly slow loading web page than like 3 days to be sent some information in the mail? It's like, it shouldn't be that way. We should be like feeling so relaxed and expansive about how much time we have. And the idea I explore in the book is that part of what's going on here is just that we have now, thanks to technological developments, got to the point where it really does feel like we are almost able to do everything we want instantaneously, almost able to cook our food in 0 seconds flat because it only takes 2 minutes in the microwave, almost able to find any information that we want, without any perceptible time delay. And so in that situation of feeling like you are very nearly God, it's way more frustrating to run up against the remaining ways in which you aren't. The fact that novels still take time to consume, the fact that there are some slow loading web pages, the fact that it does take 2 whole minutes to heat some food in the microwave instead of 0. If you work in an office with a microwave, it's always been cancelled out at like 7 seconds, because I'm sure people tell themselves because their food was ready, but actually I think it's because they're just like, they couldn't wait, they couldn't bear it anymore. And that's the moment at which they were like, screw this, I'm just going to take the food out because I cannot bring myself to wait these seconds. It's really, this is totally anecdotal, but I think that people get more impatient and angrier in traffic, in road traffic, now that so much of our life is lived on smartphones operating at broadband speeds, because I feel like the contrast between so much of what we can do and the material obstacles of the cars in front just gets more and more pronounced and enraging.
I wondered if the pandemic had in any way exasperated that, because we now do even more online when we're used to food being delivered as and when we want it. That when we interact with the physical world, those frustrations, I don't know, a year of living inside, I think, has to an extent made us even more unaccepting of the slowness of the real world.
Could be, I don't know that, and I think there are also I think there are also things we see afresh and appreciate and value about the concrete material world as a result of the time, the time in the pandemic. But it's certainly plausible, definitely.
If you have any questions whilst watching, please add them in the chat window. We'll get to those after I've asked you about, well, let's say that we have embraced our finitude and we've decided which big rocks we want to put into our jar. What are some tips that you would give us to start embracing this lifestyle? What can we actively do now to kind of to be better at this?
It's a really good question.
You should end the book. You speak about some tips.
It's a really good question. I'm a little bit conflicted about answering it, because I do think that ultimately this is about a shift in perspective. It is about seeing things differently. I don't mean that I expect people to sort of read my book and have a sort of instant spiritual enlightenment experience. It can be a small perspective shift. I think it is mainly about sort of feeling your way into this limit embracing mindset. And what you find then sometimes is that it's really obvious what techniques or methods you should use to implement that. Or one thing I've found, for example, is that productivity techniques I experimented with years ago but did so then in the spirit of trying to become the perfect controller of my time, they're perfectly useful ways to organize the day now, but I'm holding them much more loosely as a result of having felt my way somewhat into this different mindset. That said, I definitely think there are some approaches to organizing work and life, for example, that make more sense and that go with this mindset more than others. One whole set of them is any kind of technique or approach to work that focuses on sort of serializing, on making big projects sequential, on getting closer to that state of doing one thing at a time, whether that's literally on the level of the individual task or on the level of major projects, sort of making most of them queue and line up behind one that you're focusing on now and moving it through and finishing it. So the Kanban approach to workflow management that I'm sure many people will be familiar with. There's a great book called Personal Kanban by Jim Benson and Tony Ann Barry about applying this that kind of approach, which is obviously a team approach to your individual workflow. There are lots of other ways. I give a very simple one in the book about, well, let me stop and pause. The point is that all these things have in common is that they limit your work in progress. They say, okay, here are the 40 things that feel like they matter, and here are the 3 or so that I'm going to give my attention to, and I'm not going to move on to the others until at least one of those 3 is completed. So you sort of bring yourself to live with the anxiety of knowing that all these other things are going uncompleted in order to bring something to completion. And then just quickly, I think all sort of time boxing and time blocking approaches can be well adapted to this mindset. If you say, I'm going to try to ring fence 2 or 3 hours of the morning for sort of focused work that really matters to me, and I'm going to try to limit my email processing time to 1.5 hours towards the end of the day. In both those cases, what you're saying is, you're not saying I'm going to finish this project today, or I'm going to get to the bottom of my email today. You're going time first. You're saying, I'm going to dedicate this amount of time to it. I'm going to stop at the end of that time. That's kind of a way of thinking about your schedule that really respects the finitude of your time, instead of one that goes tasks first and says, I've got to get through this whole list come what may. And then you find, that you're still at your desk at 11 p.m. and that the list just got twice as long during the course of the day anyway.
I think you've actually, if we can bring up Julie's question, I think you've actually kind of answered this. So based on Oliver's thoughts on the negativity of distraction, I'm curious to hear his take on multitasking and how we can do it in a more time efficient manner. I feel like you're saying don't do multitasking.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little, there are some subtleties here. There's research that show, certain forms of multitasking with using different kinds of attentional channels and stuff that can work. I don't tell people they shouldn't listen to a podcast while they're doing the vacuuming or something. You can combine tasks meaningfully in that way. When it comes to our sort of focused attention on sort of mentally taxing tasks, you basically just can't multitask anyway. And if you think that you are doing, what you're really doing is rapidly switching between things, between keeping half an eye on your email inbox and a piece of writing you're trying to do, say, and calling it multitasking. And I think that generally what happens there, I think there are personality differences. I don't want to tell people they definitely should never do it. But generally what happens there, if you have, 3 or 4 or 5 potential destinations for your attention at any moment, is that as soon as any one of them gets difficult or challenging, you just bounce off to one that's a bit easier. And I think this probably especially happens more on the level of projects as opposed to tasks. In other words, to some degree, manage your moment-to-moment tasks how you like. But if you are really telling yourself that, say in my case, it could be 3 articles that I really care about. If I'm really telling myself that all of those 3 are going to be kind of moved forward roughly at the same time or during the same period of time, all that happens is that the moment one of them becomes difficult, because guess what? Meaningful and important things feel difficult and uncomfortable. You just move to the other one. So you end up managing to make no progress on them because you're just sort of escaping the difficulty at each point. So, it's not that you can't ever combine tasks or don't ever need to keep an eye on some on your email while doing something else, but that like if you see what's going on there and you become more conscious of it, you're much more likely to be able to avoid this situation of like not really doing anything, because what you're actually doing in those contexts is pursuing the emotional feeling of being in control, taking care of business, having fingers in pies, at the expense of getting things done that you care about.
Brilliant. Look, let's take Peter's question. Is this the midlife crisis book like this? Do you need to have chased extreme productivity first, and having achieved common life goals, family, career, financial, to begin seeking a new perspective on time?
It's such a good question. There's two interpretations of it, right? Did this book emerge from my having a midlife crisis? Probably in some sense. And then is it only useful for people who are at that stage? And I tried very consciously in writing this book to not make it a book that was only beneficial to people who'd sort of exhausted all those techniques, or perhaps what I mean is to point out certain truths about how those techniques work that might accelerate a sort of profitable kind of crisis in someone who is in their 30s or their late 20s rather than in their 40s like me. I think there's some truth to this, right? I think that one of the easiest ways to understand the limitations of this kind of limit denying approach to life is to pursue it very energetically for a number of years and exhaust it and realize that a different method is required. And I also think that many of the sort of things that people achieve in the first half of adulthood, which is often things like establishing themselves in a career, separating off from their family of origin and being part of their own family. These things can be done with, and perhaps even sometimes catalyzed by, a sort of unrealistic belief in the degree of your control over your life. I guess I just end up by saying that I don't think it is ever unhelpful to see how reality is when it comes to time, when it comes to our limitations. I don't think it's something that you can only understand at a certain point in life, and I don't think it's something that it's beneficial to sort of have kept from you, to have kept from you at an earlier stage of life. I'll be honest, I think I would be surprised if there were sort of 16, 17-year-olds who thought that this book spoke to them. I would be very gratified, but I think it probably is something that comes through. I also think that the age at which people encounter the sort of impossible demands of the world that we've created is clearly getting lower, right? The age at which people complain about burnout. I mean, burnout is a thing that people encounter in their 20s now, judging by all sorts of reports and books and studies. Not something that you have to have got into your sort of mid 50s before you're sort of exhausted enough to encounter it. So I think that hopefully the relevance of this, the age at which this book is relevant to people, is falling as the world gets more and more insane with respect to time.
Does the pace of acceleration is accelerating is how something to me. Let's take Mario's question. Thanks for the talk. My question is about attention span. Is there any reliable evidence on shortened attention spans / patience in the modern world? Is it real or is it a myth? Did you do any research on this?
Attention span is a really weird concept. It's a very good question. Attention span is a really weird concept that I have tried to understand and don't write about in the book because it just seems extremely it sort of falls apart on closer inspection. Patience, I think there's good reason to believe that we sort of tolerate shorter and shorter amounts of time that it takes to do things or to have information communicated to us. There's all sorts of fascinating longitudinal research on like the length of edits in movies and the length of political speeches and sort of things like that at least seem to be responding to a desire for shorter and shorter bits of focus. I think that, I don't think that it's the most useful way to think about what's happening to our attention, to think about that we are less and less able to focus for extended periods of time. I think it is probably more helpful, and certainly more clearly true anyway, that we are more and more tempted to abandon those focused periods of time, and that there are more and more services and devices only too willing to, use cutting edge technology to keep us distracted once we have left that focus for distraction. So it's, in a way, you're talking about attention span there, but in a way you're talking about the sense that there are other possibilities. And if you find yourself in a hut on a mountainside with no internet access and nothing to do but write your novel, you're more likely to write your novel not because you've suddenly developed a long attention span, but because alternatives have been taken away from you. The sort of tormenting choice of other options is gone for a while.
Yeah, I find when I really need to get something done, I will leave my phone and laptop at home and take a notepad and a pen to a coffee shop, and that's that. I can't do anything else except get through that. I would love to know, how are you thinking about teaching this to you have a son? How are you thinking about sort of teaching this? How can we what should we be teaching our children about this concept?
Such an interesting question, and I don't feel like, he's 4 turning 5, so I still really don't feel like I know what I'm doing when it comes to parenting. And also he keeps getting older and changing, so anything I do learn becomes out of date. I have been sort of fascinated and slightly dismayed to see, obviously everyone says this about kids, right? They reflect your own personality back to you in ways that are often uncomfortable.
It's quite scary.
That when he started to sort of ask what we were doing next and trying to like get a schedule for the day into his head, I was like, oh my God, I've really totally inculcated productivity geekhood into him. And I'm hoping that, I think I see that being out here in spending more time in nature is something that sort of seeps into his bones. I tell you what I think is the most sort of daunting lesson that I have learned about inculcating lessons, I guess, is that you really have to do it yourself if you want a kid to do it too. In other words, if you want your child to grow up to be someone who isn't checking their phone every 3 seconds, you have to not check your phone every 3 seconds. And even more weirdly, I think it's true that you have to not be. I mean, he doesn't have a phone, but you know what I mean. He's already, he's very interested by screens that are in the house, and that's fine. But I don't want him to be completely fixated by them. Not only do you have to be better at it yourself in their presence, but you sort of have to genuinely live it in your whole life, even when they're in bed. It's a really strange kind of, almost kind of paranormal phenomenon or something, right? That like. You can't just put them to bed and then for 2 hours become a completely scattered, terrible user of time or something like that if you really want to model those lessons. So that's what I'm sort of grappling with. I don't want to make it sound entirely to do with screens. That's such a sort of, everyone's always worrying about that so much. But like, to be present in the moment, like, I feel like the very best thing I can do is to be better at that.
And do you think writing the book, as a self-confessed time management nerd, do you think writing the book has helped you become better at,
Yeah, no, definitely. I think lots of people sometimes assume that way books get written is you sort of have a great insight and then you set it down in writing. But for me, the experience of writing this book was that I did sort of have to, as I discovered what I thought about time through writing it, I did have to sort of become more of that person. Partly it's just accountability, right? I mean, if I'm going to give some talk somewhere and someone spots me like impatiently freaking out about how like long the microwave is taking, then I'm kind of, it's pretty embarrassing. But more generally and more authentically, it's just like, no, I understand intellectually a huge number of things to be true now about time that I previously didn't. And then the long haul is kind of living into those intellectual realizations, and I've done it somewhat, and I've got a long way to go.
Wonderful. Well, look, Oliver, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been genuinely insightful. I can't recommend the book enough. Available in audio. You said you've done the audiobook as well, so
Yep.
that's available. I have not done one of these talks and put as many post-it notes inside it,
Glad to see it.
as ever. So yeah, genuinely recommend. It is a great read for everyone. A good use of one of your 4,000 weeks, I think, was a quote I've stolen from another review online. So look, thank you. So on behalf of everyone watching now and in the future, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully one day for your next book, you can join us in the office. Would be delightful. Otherwise, Oliver, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.